She wasn't selling herself. She was selling 6 months of her life, for a kidney for her dying grandmother, and enough money so she wouldn't have to count her pennies before bed. The man on the other end of the line wasn't an angel. He was Lucien Veloro, the strategist of the underworld, a man whose name both politicians and crime bosses feared mentioning. And he wanted a wife. Camille Arden thought she understood the deal. She was completely wrong. If you're watching this video, please comment the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has progressed. And watch to the end, because this is just the beginning. The notice from Mercy General arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Camille Arden's debit card was declined at a gas station for a $12 purchase. She stood at the pump in her scrubs, still smelling like the overnight shift, antiseptic and floor cleaner, and the particular staleness of a hospital that never fully slept, and watched the transaction fail twice before she gave up and drove home on a quarter tank. The notice was paper clipped to 3 other envelopes when she got to her apartment. 2 were collection letters. 1 was a past due on her student loan, a number so large it had stopped feeling like money and started feeling like a geological feature, something permanent and immovable, carved into the landscape of her life. The Mercy General letter was different. It was printed on department letterhead and signed by someone named Dr. Ellison Marsh, director of nephrology, and it said, in the careful language of institutional regret, that Edna Arden's position on the donor waiting list had been reviewed and that, given current resource allocation, her estimated wait for a viable kidney match had been extended to 22 months. 22 months. Camille read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor of her kitchen because her legs stopped working, and she stayed there for a while with her back against the cabinet and the letter on the linoleum in front of her and the refrigerator humming over her head. Edna was 68 years old. Her kidneys were functioning at 11%. 11% meant dialysis 3 times a week, which meant the clinic van picking her up at 6 in the morning while Camille was still at work, which meant the slow mechanical exhaustion of a body being kept alive by a machine while it waited for something better. The doctors had been careful not to say what 11% plus 22 more months actually meant. They didn't have to. Camille had been a nurse long enough to translate medical diplomacy. She was 26 years old. She had $64 in her checking account. Her grandmother was dying by increments in a dialysis center on the other side of the city, and there was nothing Camille could do about any of it except keep showing up to her overnight shifts and handing her paychecks directly to debt collectors and waiting for the math to change. The math never changed. She ate a bowl of cereal for dinner because it was the cheapest thing in the cabinet and she wasn't hungry anyway. And then she went to bed with her phone plugged in beside her and her alarm set for 10 p.m. so she could make her midnight shift. And she lay on her back staring at the ceiling and thought about her grandmother's hands. The way they felt when Edna held hers, papery and warm and certain in a way that Camille had never found in any other part of her life. Edna had raised her after her mother left, and her father followed shortly after in the way unreliable people follow each other, into absence. Edna had worked double shifts at a dry cleaner for 11 years to put Camille through school. Edna had sat in the front row of every graduation and cried without embarrassment each time. Camille was not going to let Edna die on a waiting list, but she didn't know how to stop it. She slept for 4 hours and then worked 8, and when she came home the next morning, there was an envelope on the floor beneath her mail slot that had not been there when she left. No stamp, no return address, no logo or letterhead, just her full legal name typed in black ink. Camille Elaine Arden, centered on the envelope with the precision of something official and cold. She stood in her doorway in her coat with her bag over her shoulder and stared at it for a moment before she picked it up. Inside was a single piece of paper. 1 sentence. Your grandmother's treatment can be fully funded. You will be contacted tomorrow at 9 a.m. Camille read it 3 times. Then she put it on her kitchen table and stepped back from it like it might move. Her first thought was scam. Her second thought was wrong address. Her third thought, the one that arrived quietly after the others and refused to leave, was that she hoped it wasn't. She didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table and watched the envelope and drank bad coffee and waited for morning, and at exactly 9 a.m., her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was male, measured, and completely without warmth. He identified himself as Mr. Harlan Voss, attorney, and he told her he was calling on behalf of a private client who had a specific proposal for her consideration. He spoke in the flat, careful cadence of someone accustomed to delivering unusual things, as if they were entirely routine, and what he delivered was this. His client required a wife. The arrangement would be contractual. 6 months in duration. Her responsibilities would include public appearances, social engagements, and the maintenance of a credible marital presentation for the purpose of stabilizing a period of significant business transition. She would reside at the client's estate. She would be provided with a full wardrobe, a monthly personal allowance, a separate bedroom suite with private access, and a security detail. Upon completion of the 6-month term, she would receive a lump sum payment sufficient to retire all outstanding debts and establish a substantial financial reserve. And her grandmother's medical treatment, all of it, every dialysis session, every specialist, every medication, and full funding for an expedited private track kidney transplant evaluation would begin within 72 hours of her signing the agreement. Camille stood in her kitchen in her coat, which she hadn't taken off yet, and listened to all of this. "Who is your client?" she said. A pause, brief, almost imperceptible. "Lucien Veloro." She knew the name. Everyone in the city knew the name, the way you knew the names of things that operated at a distance from ordinary life. Hedge funds, pharmaceutical lobbyists, the weather patterns of places you'd never visit. Lucien Veloro was in financial news sometimes, acquisition announcements, the occasional charity gala. He was in other conversations too, quieter ones, the kind that happened between people who paid close attention to where money moved and who moved it. He was 51 years old. He had no publicly confirmed family. 6 months earlier, he had survived an assassination attempt that left him with severe spinal damage and confined, according to the coverage, to a wheelchair. "I need time to think," Camille said. "Of course," Voss said. "You have until Friday noon." He hung up. Camille stood in her kitchen and looked at her hands. They were steady. She didn't understand why they were steady. She went to the bathroom and turned on the shower and stood under it until the hot water ran out. And then she stood under the cold for a little longer because the cold made it harder to think about things she didn't want to think about. And when she got out, she called the dialysis center and asked how Edna was doing. And the nurse said she was tired today, but she'd eaten breakfast. And Camille said thank you and hung up and sat on the edge of her bed. 22 months. She called back on Friday at 11:47 a.m. The car that came for her 3 days later was black and large and said nothing about itself. 2 men in the front, neither of them speaking. The city she'd lived in her entire life scrolled past the windows like a film she was being slowly extracted from, the familiar skyline receding as they moved outward through increasingly sparse streets until the streets themselves gave way to a long private road bordered by stone walls and winter-stripped trees, and then through iron gates that opened without visible human intervention, and then up a gravel drive towards something that could only be described as a compound if you were being restrained about it. The Veloro estate. It was not what she'd expected, and she hadn't known what she'd expected until she saw what it actually was. Old stone. Very old. 3 stories of it, gray and deliberate, with narrow windows that watched the driveway like eyes. The grounds were formal and bare in the winter. Clipped hedges, gravel paths, a fountain that had been turned off for the season, its basin dry and full of dead leaves. Everything about the place communicated a kind of authority that had nothing to prove, the way truly old money doesn't announce itself because it doesn't have to. A woman named Mrs. Hargrove met her at the door, 50s, dark blazer, efficient. She showed Camille to her suite on the 2nd floor without unnecessary commentary, pointed out the intercom system and the call button for the house staff, told her dinner was at 7 in the east dining room, and left. Camille stood in the center of a room larger than her entire apartment and looked at it. The bed had 4 posts and linen the color of fog. There were fresh flowers on the writing desk, white dahlias, stems cut clean, and a carafe of water beside them. The wardrobe was stocked, she discovered when she opened it. Someone had sourced her sizes. Wool trousers, silk blouses, a heavy charcoal coat, 2 formal gowns in dark colors. She touched the sleeve of the coat and felt a complicated, ugly thing move through her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. She changed out of her own clothes and went downstairs at 7. The east dining room was long and underlit. A table that could have seated 16 occupied by 2 place settings at the far end, across from each other. The chairs were pulled out, the candles were already burning. There was wine she hadn't asked for, and water she hadn't asked for, and bread she hadn't asked for, And there was, seated at the head of the table, in a wheelchair positioned to face the door, Lucien Veloro. He was not what the financial photographs suggested. The photographs showed a man in controlled settings, podiums, boardrooms, charity events, where the distance made it possible to see the wealth and the precision without anything behind them. In person, the first thing she noticed was that he was not performing anything. He sat with the stillness of someone who had learned to conserve energy, one hand resting flat on the arm of the wheelchair, the other holding a glass of water. He was watching her walk across the room with the expression of someone confirming a calculation. He was lean in the way illness makes people lean, but not weak. There was something in the structure of him, the set of his jaw, the quality of his attention, that suggested whatever the bullet had taken from his body had failed to reach anything essential. He waited until she sat. "Camille Arden," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not warm, not cold, simply direct. "Mr. Veloro," she said. "Lucien." He said it without instruction, a correction offered and immediately done with. "You accepted the arrangement." "I did." "Without a counteroffer." "I didn't have leverage for a counteroffer." Something shifted in his expression, not quite approval. Recognition, maybe. "Most people in your position attempt one anyway." "Most people in my position don't have a sick grandmother," she said. "I'm not negotiating for sport." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "You're not." The dinner was served by a staff member who appeared and disappeared without speaking. The food was extraordinary. Braised short rib, roasted root vegetables, something involving mushrooms and cream that Camille ate more of than she intended because she hadn't had a real meal in days. She was aware of how that probably looked and found she didn't particularly care. Lucien ate sparingly and watched her without pretending not to. "You're a nurse," he said at some point. "Yes, overnight shifts, St. Mercy. You know where I work." "I know considerably more than where you work," he said. "You knew that before you came." She put her fork down and looked at him. "I knew you'd done research. I didn't know the scope." "Does it matter?" "It matters that you had people going through my life without my knowledge." "Everything we did was legal," he said. "That's not the same as it being acceptable." A pause. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture that seemed to indicate he was filing the point rather than dismissing it. "No," he said. "It's not." She hadn't expected that. The acknowledgement sat between them strangely, too clean for the context. "What am I actually here for?" she said. "Specifically." He set down his glass. 6 months ago, I was shot in the back by a man who worked for me for 11 years. The damage to my spine is significant and partially permanent. In the world I operate in, visible physical vulnerability is an invitation. There are 3 ongoing negotiations that depend on the perception that my position is stable and my focus is undivided. He looked at her without blinking. A man who has recently married projects stability. A man alone in a wheelchair projects something else. You need a prop. I need a partner who can sustain a convincing presentation under scrutiny, he said. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. His voice carried no argument, only certainty. You are intelligent, medically literate, and accustomed to maintaining composure under sustained pressure. You do not perform vulnerability. You are from a world entirely removed from mine, which is a form of cover in itself. And you have a reason to hold to the agreement that money alone wouldn't create. She stared at him. You mean my grandmother? I mean, you are not mercenary, he said. Mercenary people are unreliable. You have something to protect. That makes you predictable in the ways I require. The candles burned between them. The room was very quiet. You've thought about this for a long time, Camille said. I've thought about most things for a long time. That's not something most people would say out loud. Most people are uncomfortable with accuracy, he said. She picked up her wine glass and held it without drinking. What happens if I decide this isn't working and I want to leave? Then we dissolve the arrangement and you keep whatever portion of the financial settlement corresponds to time served, he said. Your grandmother's treatment continues regardless. That clause is unconditional. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because I don't trade in extortion. You trade in manipulation. Yes, he said. I do. There's a difference. She drank the wine. After dinner, Mrs. Hargrove showed her to a small study off the main hall where Voss was waiting with a document 47 pages long. Camille was a nurse, not a lawyer, but she read it anyway, every page, and it was exactly what it claimed to be: specific, detailed, each clause exactly as Voss had described. There was a provision ensuring Edna's medical care was held in a separate irrevocable trust that Lucien could not access or retract. There was a privacy agreement, a conduct clause that enumerated responsibilities on both sides with the same precision as everything else. At the bottom, 2 signature lines. Camille signed her name and went upstairs and lay on the enormous bed in her new room and stared at the ceiling and thought, "What have I done?" And then thought, "I know exactly what I've done." And then thought about Edna's hands until she fell asleep. She woke up the next morning before 6 and couldn't sleep, and went downstairs looking for coffee, and found the kitchen occupied by a woman named Rosalind, who was the morning cook and who made Camille a strong black coffee and a piece of toast without being asked. And then Camille took her coffee and walked because she didn't know what else to do with herself. The east wing of the estate was longer than she'd realized. She followed the main corridor past several closed doors and turned a corner and stopped because behind a pair of double doors left slightly ajar. There was noise, the sustained rhythmic grunt of physical effort. And she looked through the gap and saw a room fitted out as a rehabilitation gym, and in it, Lucien Veloro was not in his wheelchair. He was at the parallel bars, standing, technically. Both hands white-knuckled on the bars, his whole body trembling with the effort of keeping himself upright. A physical therapist, young man, professional composure, stood 3 feet away without touching him, which told Camille immediately that touching was not allowed. Lucien took a step. It was not a step the way walking is a step. It was an act of force. His leg moved not by reflex, but by something closer to rage, hauled forward through sheer will, while the rest of his body shook and sweat ran freely down the side of his face. He took another step, and another. And then his right knee buckled, and he went down. Not all the way. He caught himself on the bars, but his chin dropped to his chest, and he stayed there for a moment with his weight hanging between his arms and his knuckles white, and the tendons in his neck standing out. And the therapist said something quietly, and Lucien said something back in a low voice that Camille couldn't hear, and the therapist took a step back, and Lucien straightened himself. His face, in that moment, was the face of a man who had discovered what it felt like to lose something he'd never thought to appreciate having. Camille walked back to her room without her coffee. She did not tell him she had seen. She understood, without being told, that there were things in this house that were not available for acknowledgement, and that this was one of them. The first week passed in a strange, suspended state that resembled normality, the way stage sets resemble rooms. She learned the house's rhythms. Lucien disappeared into his study by 7:30 a.m. and did not emerge until midday. Staff moved through the ground floor in organized silence, and dinner was the only fixed shared point of the day. At dinner, they talked, not the way she had expected them to talk, performatively, strategically, with the conversation serving the arrangement. They talked the way people do when they're both tired and the room is quiet and food is in front of them, and no one has the energy for theater. He asked her questions, not about her background, which he clearly already knew, but about what she thought, about a piece in the financial news, about a medication she'd mentioned in passing when he asked about her work, about why she'd chosen nursing over medicine proper, a question she hadn't been asked in a long time. And she found herself answering honestly, because nursing meant contact, actual physical proximity to the person, and doctors got to keep a distance that she'd never wanted. He listened like he was cataloging the information, but he listened. And then one evening, at the end of the first week, she came down at midnight because she couldn't sleep, and she found a pot of tea on the kitchen counter. Her tea, the specific chamomile blend she'd mentioned once in passing, still warm, and a note in compact, precise handwriting that said, "Only for the insomnia. Rosalind knows to make it." She stood in the kitchen with the note in her hand and understood with a specific and uncomfortable clarity that this was not going to be the transaction she had signed up for. The first public engagement came 11 days after her arrival. A dinner at the Carrington Club. Old, private, the kind of place that didn't need a website. She wore the dark green gown from the wardrobe because it fit without needing adjustment, which told her again that whoever had sourced this clothing had been precise. A car brought them through the city. Lucien was quiet in the back seat beside her, watching the window, and she studied him in the periphery and thought about the parallel bars and said nothing. Inside the club it began. 40 people in formal dress, old money mostly, with a few careful exceptions. Lucien moved through the room in his wheelchair with a kind of authority that made the room adjust to him rather than the other way around. And Camille stayed at his left and slightly behind, which felt natural until she understood it was positioning. He was keeping her within arm's reach. When people approached, she was introduced as his wife. She said the right things. She smiled the right smiles. She stayed present and composed in the way 12-hour overnight shifts train you to stay present and composed. And afterward, in the car, Lucien said, "You were good. I've dealt with difficult people under stress before," she said. "I know." He looked out the window. "That's why you're here." She looked at the side of his face. He was watching the city scroll past, and there was something in his expression, just briefly, in the space between one streetlight and the next, that was not strategy. That was something quieter and harder to name. She looked away before he could catch her looking. And then 3 weeks into the arrangement, on an evening when the temperature had dropped below freezing and the estate grounds were glazed with black ice, she heard something from the direction of the east corridor that stopped her in the hall. It was a sound that should not have been in a house like this. It was the sound of a man losing control. She followed it and pushed open the door and found Lucien on the floor of the rehabilitation room, 6 feet from his fallen wheelchair, his arms braced beneath him, his whole body rigid with the effort of not making a sound. The therapist was gone, late session, apparently, after hours. He had gotten himself down to the floor somehow and could not get back up, and he had been there long enough that his breathing was ragged, and there was a sheen of cold sweat across his jaw, and he was looking at the wall with an expression she had seen in hospitals, on people who had just been told something devastating. He heard her come in. For 3 full seconds, something moved across his face that she'd never seen there before. Raw. Exposed. Naked in the way that has nothing to do with the body. Then the mask came back. "Get Mrs. Hargrove," he said. "I'm a nurse," Camille said. "Get Mrs. Hargrove." "Lucien." She crossed the room and crouched down to his eye level and looked at him directly. "I'm a nurse. Let me help you." His jaw was very tight. He looked at the floor. She could see the muscles working in his throat. I know you don't need it," she said. "Let me help you anyway." Silence. Long and specific. The kind of silence in which a person decides something. Then he looked at her, and whatever he saw in her face, something in the steadiness of it, something that didn't offer pity or performance, made something in him go very still. "All right," he said. She helped him back into the wheelchair with the careful efficiency of someone who had transferred hundreds of patients, and she did not make it tender, and she did not make it clinical. And when it was done, she straightened up and looked at him and said, "You should tell the therapist not to schedule after-hours sessions if you're going to keep using the gym outside of them." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I should." She left him there and walked back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and breathed slowly until the feeling in her chest, whatever it was, settled back to something manageable. It didn't fully settle. She thought about his face. The 3 seconds. The thing underneath. She thought, "You are in trouble." And then she thought about her grandmother's hands, and she thought about what 22 months meant, and she thought about the contract with its 47 pages and its clean, precise language, and she told herself the feeling was proximity and stress and the distortion of unusual circumstances, and she was almost convinced. Almost. That night there was a second pot of tea on the counter, and beside it, a single gray wool coat. Her size. With a note. "The forecast is below freezing this week. No signature. None needed." Camille stood in the kitchen, in the dark, holding the coat, and understanding, with a clarity that frightened her, that the most dangerous thing in this house was not Lucien Veloro's empire, or his enemies, or even his careful, systematic manipulation. It was the possibility that underneath all of it, he meant it. The coat was still on the kitchen counter the next morning. Camille had left it there. She wasn't sure why, exactly. Not as a statement, not as protest, just as a fact. She'd stood there holding it long enough that the holding itself became strange, and then she'd put it down and gone to bed, and now it was 6:40 a.m. and she was drinking Rosalind's coffee and looking at it from across the room like it owed her an explanation. It was a good coat, heavy charcoal wool, the kind of lining that didn't make noise when you moved. Whoever had selected it knew what they were doing. That was the problem. Everything in this house was selected by someone who knew what they were doing, and the cumulative effect of that, the tea, the coat, the dining room rearranged so two people didn't have to feel the specific loneliness of a table built for 16, was starting to feel less like comfort and more like architecture. Something constructed around her while she was looking somewhere else. She picked up the coat and put it on. It fit perfectly. She hated that it fit perfectly. She went outside and walked to the east path along the perimeter of the winter gardens, and the cold was brutal and specific the way only February cold is. And the coat did what it was supposed to do. And she walked until she could think clearly and then kept walking because clarity wasn't the thing she was actually after. She was after the feeling she'd had last night before the coat. The clear, clean, contractual feeling of a transaction in progress. She could not locate it this morning. What she had instead was the memory of Lucien's face on the gymnasium floor. The 3 seconds. The thing underneath all of it that he'd immediately recovered and buried, but not quickly enough. Not from someone with 12 years of reading people in the worst hours of their lives. She went back inside and took the coat off and hung it on the rack by the door and went upstairs to shower before the day started. The day started with Voss. He appeared at 10 with a leather briefcase and the expression of a man who charged by the hour and was comfortable with that. And he and Lucien occupied the study for most of the morning while Camille stayed in the sitting room off the main hall with a medical journal she wasn't reading. Through the closed study door, she could hear voices, not words, just register and pace. And what she could hear was that whatever was being discussed, Lucien's voice stayed controlled and Voss's did not. They emerged at noon. Voss nodded at Camille with professional blankness and left. Lucien wheeled himself out and stopped when he saw her. "Lunch," he said. Not an invitation, a statement of the next event in the schedule. "What was that about?" she asked. "Business. You said there are 3 ongoing negotiations." "Yes." "Is one of them in trouble?" He looked at her for a moment. The quality of the look was appraising, not unkind. "Perceptive," he said. "You were louder than usual." Something crossed his face. Self-awareness, maybe, filtered through the particular irritation of a man who did not like being readable. "One of the parties has become difficult," he said. "It's manageable." "Is it?" "Yes." Flat, final. She let it go. Not because she believed him entirely, but because she recognized the wall when she hit it, and pushing against walls she couldn't move wasn't how she spent her energy. Lunch was quieter than dinner usually was. The afternoon light came through the south-facing windows at a low angle and caught the dust motes above the table, and Camille found herself watching Lucien's hands. He ate left-handed. She hadn't noticed that before. The right hand rested on the table between bites with a stillness that was not natural stillness, controlled stillness, the kind of stillness that costs something. "Your right hand," she said. He didn't look up. "What about it?" "Peripheral nerve damage?" A pause. "Some." "From the shooting?" "Yes." She looked at it. "Can you feel?" "Yes," he said. Sharp. A door closing. She ate her soup. After a moment he said without looking at her, "The sensation is inconsistent, some days better than others." She didn't say anything. She didn't offer condolence or medical context or the reassuring arc toward recovery that she'd have delivered in a clinical setting. She just nodded, once, and went back to her soup, and she felt rather than saw the slight shift in him at the other end of the table. Something released, minimally, like a thread that had been held too tight. They ate the rest of the meal in silence, but it was a different silence than the ones before. The wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday. Camille learned this on Wednesday from Mrs. Hargrove, who delivered the information with the same tone she used for everything. Measured, complete, containing nothing extra. 60 guests had been confirmed. A stylist would arrive Friday afternoon for fitting and preparation. The ceremony would be held in the estate ballroom. The reception would follow immediately after, lasting approximately 3 hours, to be concluded before 9 so that Lucien's medical schedule was not disrupted. His medical schedule, Camille repeated. Mr. Veloro has a standing physical therapy session at 10 p.m., Mrs. Hargrove said. He keeps it regardless of the day's other events. Camille thought about that for a moment. 10 p.m. every night, regardless. She thought about the gymnasium floor. She thought about the parallel bars. All right, she said. She called the dialysis center that evening from her room. Edna had had a better session that week. Numbers slightly improved, energy slightly up. The private care coordinator Lucien's trust had assigned was apparently extraordinary. 3 specialists had reviewed Edna's case in the last week alone, and there was a preliminary assessment scheduled for the private transplant track. Camille sat on the edge of her bed with her phone pressed against her ear and listened to all of this and thought about the coat and thought, you made the right choice. And then thought, that is exactly what someone who made the wrong choice would tell themselves. She told Edna she'd come visit soon. Edna said, don't rush, sweetheart. I'm fine. You focus on your own life for once. Camille said, yes, I will. Edna said, you sound different. Camille said, I'm tired. Edna said, no, not tired, something else. Camille said goodnight and hung up and sat there for a while with the phone in both hands. The stylist arrived Friday at 2. Her name was Dara, mid-30s, economical with words, extraordinarily good at her job. The gown had already been selected. Camille's input on this apparently had been anticipated and preemptively resolved. It was midnight blue, not white, not ivory, not the expected architecture of the bridal industry. Long and structured without being stiff, with a neckline that was formal rather than romantic. Camille stood in front of the long mirror in the dressing suite while Dara made the final adjustments and thought, whoever chose this understood her better than she'd chosen to acknowledge. Who picked the dress? She asked. Dara's eyes met hers in the mirror. The specifications came from Mr. Veloro's office. He specified the dress. He specified parameters, Dara said carefully. Structural, formal, nothing performative, nothing that would read as costume. Camille looked at herself in midnight blue and thought about the word performative and what it meant coming from Lucien Veloro, and felt the complicated, uncomfortable thing move through her chest again. It's good work, she said. Thank you, Dara said. And then, very quietly, not quite professional, he was very specific about the color. He said, she stopped. What? A brief pause. He said she doesn't wear white well. She wears real things. Dara smoothed a seam at the waist. I thought that was an unusual brief. Camille looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Saturday arrived in the way days with fixed appointments arrive. Too fast and somehow simultaneously too slow. The hours before compressed and strange. The estate was transformed in ways she hadn't seen coming. The ballroom, which she'd only glimpsed before, had been opened and set with low flowers and candlelight, and the 60 chairs arranged with formal precision. Staff she hadn't seen before moved through the ground floor with the rehearsed invisibility of people who did events well. The guests began arriving at 3. From her room, Camille could hear the cars on the gravel. She sat at the dressing table and let Dara work and listened to the sounds of people gathering below, and thought about nothing specific, which was the only way she could manage it. At 3:45, Mrs. Hargrove knocked and opened the door and said, "They're ready for you, Mrs. Veloro." The title landed strangely, not badly, strangely. Camille stood up. She walked the corridor alone and descended the main staircase and turned toward the ballroom. And the doors were open and 60 people were standing because she'd entered, and the room was lit with candles and arrangement and old authority, and at the end of the aisle, in his wheelchair at the altar position, was Lucien. She began walking. The room was very quiet. She was halfway down the aisle, precisely, exactly halfway, when it happened. Lucien placed both hands on the armrests of the wheelchair, and he stood up. It was not graceful, it was not ceremonial. It was brutal and slow, and the tendons in his neck were visible from where she was standing, and the tremor in his legs was visible to anyone in the room who cared to look, which was everyone. His jaw was set with the particular ferocity of someone doing something that hurt and refusing to let the pain have any sound. The room went completely still, not politely still, stunned still. The kind of stillness that happens when 60 people with extensive experience in power and performance witness something they cannot categorize as either. Camille stopped walking. For a moment she just stood there in the middle of the aisle in midnight blue and looked at him, and something in her chest cracked along a fault line she hadn't known was there. She walked the rest of the way. When she reached him, his legs were shaking visibly, and his color was not good, and she could see what the effort was costing him. And she did the thing a nurse does and the thing a person does, which were the same thing. She put her hand under his arm, lightly, steadying without making it a support he hadn't asked for. He looked at her. "You didn't have to do this," she said low, just for him. His eyes were very dark and very direct, and there was something in them she hadn't seen before, something that had gotten loose from the careful management. "Yes," he said. "I did." The ceremony was short. The officiant, a civil authority, nothing else, conducted it in under 12 minutes. They exchanged the legally required language, and Lucien's voice was controlled and quiet, and Camille's voice was steady, and when it was done he was still standing, barely, and she kept her hand at his arm until they turned to face the room, and the room, collectively, exhaled. The reception was the harder thing. 60 people, carefully selected, and every one of them a student of behavior. Camille moved through the room at Lucien's side and said the right things, and held the glass without drinking too much, and watched the room the way she'd been trained to watch rooms. For changes, for pressure, for the particular signals of someone working towards something. There were several people she didn't recognize, and one she did, Aldrich Beaumont, who she knew from news coverage as a shipping magnate with no publicly confirmed connections to anything illegal, and who had, in several deep background financial profiles she'd read years ago, without knowing why she remembered them now, been described as instrumental in several major asset movements through holding structures that had never quite been explained. Beaumont spent 20 minutes with Lucien in the corner of the room, with 2 other men she didn't recognize, and when they finished, Lucien's expression was flatter than usual in a way she was starting to read as specific. Not blankness, but the controlled neutralization of something that had made him angry. She caught his eye across the room. He gave the smallest possible headshake. Not now. She turned and kept circulating. At 7:30, she found the bar and got water. She'd switched to water an hour ago because she needed to be sharp, and the wine was good, and that combination was a problem. And a woman appeared beside her. Elegant. 50 or near it, the kind of elegant that doesn't announce itself. Dark hair drawn back. A ring on the right hand, not the left. She didn't take anything from the bar. She had arrived with a glass already held in a way that suggested she'd been holding it for a while without drinking. "Camille," the woman said. "Not Mrs. Veloro. Not a question. Just her name, the way you say the name of someone you've already decided something about." Camille looked at her. "I don't think we've been introduced," Camille said. "We haven't." The woman smiled. It was a precise smile with nothing behind it. "I'm Seraphine Vale. I'm an old associate of your husband's." "Seraphine," Camille repeated. "What kind of associate?" "The kind that knows things," Seraphine said pleasantly. "I won't take much of your time. I just want to offer my congratulations. And perhaps," she tilted her head slightly, "a small gift." Camille looked at her steadily. "I'm not sure I need any gifts from people I don't know. You might need this one." Seraphine reached into her small clutch and produced a card. Plain stock. An address printed on it and nothing else. "There's something I think you should understand about how your marriage was assembled, Camille. Not the contract. The architecture of it. The decisions that came before the contract." Her eyes were direct and completely calm. "It might answer some questions you haven't let yourself ask yet." "I haven't asked them because I don't have them," Camille said. "You have them," Seraphine said. "You're just too intelligent to have asked them in a room where the answer would inconvenience you." She placed the card on the bar beside Camille's water glass. "Come or don't, but know what you're in before the 6 months are half over." She walked away into the room and didn't look back. Camille looked at the card. She picked it up. She put it in the small clutch Mrs. Hargrove had provided and went back to the reception and stood beside her husband for the remaining hour and a half and did not say anything about it. She told herself she would throw the card away. She did not throw the card away. Tuesday, she went. She told herself it was due diligence. She told herself she was a practical person, and practical people gathered information, and information was not action. She took the estate car, she had access to one of the secondary vehicles, and drove herself into the city for the first time since arriving. And the city felt strange and too fast. The way places feel when you've been in a quiet house long enough that volume becomes unfamiliar. The address on the card was a private office above a law firm in the financial district. Seraphine was waiting in a room with a long table and no art on the walls and a view of the street below. "Thank you for coming," Seraphine said. "I want to be clear that I'm here for information, not a conversation," Camille said. "I'm not your ally, and I'm not his enemy. I'm a person who made a contract, and I'd like to understand what I'm in." "Clear enough," Seraphine said. She opened a folder on the table. "Sit down." Camille sat. What Seraphine laid out took 35 minutes. She was methodical and specific in the way lawyers are when they want something to be inarguable. And what she laid out was this. Camille had not been found. She had been built. Over 11 months before the initial envelope arrived, a team within Lucien's organization, not Voss, someone further inside, had compiled a targeted profile. Not merely background research, a psychological architecture, identifying her precise vulnerabilities, her emotional response patterns, her needs that money alone wouldn't satisfy, her specific capacity for loyalty and endurance under sustained pressure. They had mapped how she would respond to controlled vulnerability. They had identified that a display of physical weakness from a powerful man would engage her protective instinct in a way that manufactured to attach rather than simply employ. The late-night tea, the coat, the rearranged dining room, none of it was spontaneous. All of it had been listed in a document 18 months before she ever set foot in the estate, a document titled, "With Specific Clinical Coldness, Engagement and Retention Protocol." Subject, Arden. Seraphine slid a copy across the table. Camille looked at it. The formatting was clean. The language was operational. Bullet points with clinical descriptions of interventions designed to produce specific emotional responses. Someone had anticipated her insomnia. Someone had anticipated that she would respond to the gymnasium floor moment. That moment had not been staged, Seraphine acknowledged. The fall had been genuine, but it had been on a list of probable high-attachment trigger events 6 months before it occurred. Camille sat very still. "He didn't have to manufacture anything," she said, and her voice was even, and that cost her. "The situation itself was—" "He manufactured the situation," Seraphine said. "Not unkindly, just precisely. The envelope, the call, the specific framing of your grandmother's treatment as immediately actionable, the timing, your worst financial month in 3 years identified in advance." She paused. "The attorney who called you is not named Harlan Voss. His name is Derek Saunders, and he specializes in targeted acquisition agreements for high-value private arrangements. This isn't the first one." Camille looked at the page. The words "Subject Arden" sat at the top in the same typeface as everything else, and it was the typeface, neutral, institutional, that got into her the way sharp things get in, not in a rush, but in a slide. She had been a subject. She had been a profile. She had been a set of mapped vulnerabilities and calibrated interventions and projected response curves, and every moment that had felt like accident, the tea, the coat, the 3 seconds on the gymnasium floor, had existed on a document that predated her knowledge of his name. She stood up. "I need you to understand," Seraphine said, "that this isn't about destroying the arrangement. My interest is in—" "I don't care about your interest," Camille said. She picked up the folder. Seraphine didn't stop her. She walked out of the office and down the stairs and onto the street and stood on the pavement for a moment in the cold, the folder under her arm and the city noise around her, and she breathed. In, out, clinical. The way she breathed in triage when something bad had just become worse and there was still work to do. She got in the car. She drove back to the estate. She went upstairs and sat at the writing desk in her room and opened the folder and read it again. All of it, more slowly this time. And the second reading was worse than the first because the second time she could map specific events against specific entries and know, not suspect, know, that the architecture had worked exactly as designed. She had felt it working. She had noticed it working and told herself it was circumstance and proximity, and told herself she was rational enough to recognize the difference between an environment that was comfortable and an environment that had been engineered specifically to make her feel at home. She had not been rational enough. That was the part that burned. Not that it had happened, that she had felt it happening and not trusted herself enough to stop it. She put the folder in the drawer of the writing desk and locked it. That evening she came to dinner. She sat across from Lucien and unfolded her napkin. And the first course arrived, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and his expression was the same composed, attentive presence it always was. And she thought about the words engagement and retention protocol and ate her soup and did not say a word. He noticed. He would always notice. She watched him notice. The slight adjustment of his focus, the careful attention to her face, the reading of her that he did automatically and constantly, and that she now understood was not natural observational intelligence. Or not only that. "You went into the city," he said between courses. "Yes." "You took the sedan. I didn't realize I needed to log my movements." A pause. "You don't. I'm making conversation." "No," she said. "You're locating information." Silence. The candles. The room. "Did something happen in the city?" he said. She looked at him directly. "I met someone at your reception who had something to tell me." His expression did not change. That was the tell. It didn't change because he was managing it. "Who?" he said. "Seraphine Vale." The name landed, and she watched it land, and the thing that happened in his face was brief and controlled and almost invisible, and she caught all of it. He said nothing for a moment. "What did she tell you?" he said. Camille set down her fork. "You know what she told me." He looked at the table. "Did she show you documentation?" he said. "Yes." The silence that followed was the longest one they had shared at that table, and it had a different quality than all the others. Dense, pressurized, with something in it that couldn't be taken back. "The documentation is accurate," he said finally. She had not expected him to say that. She had expected deflection or reframing or the practiced legal language of a man who dealt in ambiguity. The directness of it hit her somewhere unexpected. "I know it's accurate," she said. "Then you know." "I want to hear it from you," she said. "I want you to say it." His jaw was very tight. He looked at her for a long moment. "The arrangement was built," he said. "The targeting was deliberate. The selection criteria were specific to you. Every element of the initial contact was engineered to maximize your likelihood of compliance." The words were careful and exact, and they landed like a series of small, precise blows. "And the rest of it," she said. "The tea, the coat, the gym, the conversations." His hands were flat on the table, both of them, including the right one. "The initial framework created conditions," he said. "What developed within those conditions?" "Answer the question," she said. He looked at her. The candles were burning. The room was very quiet. "What came after was not in the document," he said. That's not an answer." "It's the only honest one I have," he said, and something in his voice had changed. The controlled, even register had developed a fracture in it, something underneath that she'd only heard once before, on a gymnasium floor for 3 seconds. Camille looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up, folded her napkin, placed it on the table beside her plate, and walked out of the dining room without another word. She did not go to her room. She went to the east corridor and out the side door and stood on the stone terrace in the night air without the coat, because the coat was the wrong thing to be wearing right now. And the cold came in through her dress, and she let it and breathed and looked at the frozen garden below and thought about the word subject and thought about the word home and thought about the gap between them that she'd been standing in for weeks without knowing what it was called. She heard the door behind her. She didn't turn around. Lucien wheeled himself out onto the terrace and stopped. She could hear the wheel catches. She could hear him breathing in the cold. "Camille," he said. "I don't want to do this out here," she said. "Then come inside." "I don't want to do it inside either." A long pause. "I know what the document says," he said. "I know what I built before you arrived. I am not going to tell you that wasn't what it was." "Good," she said. "Don't." "But I'm going to tell you, Lucien." She turned around then. Her face was cold, and her eyes were completely clear, and she looked at him in the dark terrace light and said, "Whatever you're about to tell me, I need you to understand that I'm not in a place right now where I can receive it as the thing you intend it to be. Do you understand that?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said quietly. "Good." She looked back at the garden. "Go inside. I'll come in when I'm ready." Another pause. The cold moved between them. "The coat is inside the door." he said. She closed her eyes. She heard the wheel catches and the door, and then silence, and she stood there in the freezing air for a long time, long past the point where the cold stopped feeling like anything in particular, and she thought about what it meant that she was standing outside in February in a thin dress instead of going upstairs, packing her bag, and calling for the car. She thought about the folder in the locked drawer. She thought about the word what came after was not in the document. She thought about the 3 seconds on the gymnasium floor. She thought about standing in the middle of an aisle watching a man stand up under unbearable cost, not for an audience, but because she was the one walking toward him and he had decided, separately from the document, outside of the protocol, in some part of him that the engineering hadn't reached, that she deserved to be met standing. She did not know if any of that was true or if she was telling herself the story she needed in order to stay. She could not tell, and the not telling was the most frightening thing that had happened to her since the envelope arrived, because Camille Arden had always been able to tell. She went inside. She picked up the coat. She put it on and stood in the cold corridor for one more moment with her hand on the wall and thought, "You are in so much trouble." And then, from somewhere deeper and quieter than thought, "You already knew that, and you came back anyway." She went upstairs. She did not sleep. By morning, she understood that the real trap was not the contract, not the document, not the estate or the arrangement or the 60 guests at a candlelit wedding, or even the coat that fit perfectly because someone had mapped the precise dimensions of her need. The real trap was simpler than all of that. The real trap was that she no longer knew where the engineering ended and the truth began. And neither, she suspected, did he. She didn't eat breakfast the next morning. Rosalind left a plate on the counter. Eggs, toast, sliced fruit arranged with the quiet care that characterized everything in this house. And Camille walked past it and poured coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the frozen garden and thought about nothing specific, which was the only way she'd learned to manage the specific kind of exhaustion that came not from lack of sleep, but from the sustained effort of holding contradictory things inside the same body without letting either of them win. She'd been doing it for 3 days. 3 days since the terrace. 3 days since dinner. 3 days of the house continuing its precise, choreographed rhythms around her as if nothing had shifted. Lucien in his study by 7:30, Mrs. Hargrove moving the ground floor with organizational silence, Rosalind producing meals that were too good for the circumstances, and Camille moving through all of it with the surface composure of someone who had not yet decided what to do with what she knew. She knew what the document said. She knew what subject Arden meant when placed at the top of a page in institutional typeface. She also knew what she'd felt on the terrace when she heard the door and his wheels on the stone, and she knew that the knowing didn't cancel anything out, and that the not canceling out was its own kind of problem. On the 4th day, she called the dialysis center, and the coordinator told her Edna's preliminary private track evaluation had been completed and the results had been submitted to a transplant board for expedited review. The coordinator's voice had the particular warmth of someone delivering genuinely good news, and Camille sat on the edge of her bed and listened and thought about the mechanism behind the warmth, the money, the trust, the irrevocable clause, the machine Lucien had set in motion for reasons she could not cleanly identify anymore. And when the call ended, she sat there for a long time with her phone in both hands and felt something she didn't want to feel, which was gratitude, which arrived without her permission and refused to leave. On the 5th day, Lucien knocked on the door of the sitting room where she was reading. She looked up. He stayed in the doorway. He did not come in without being asked, which she registered. "There's an event Friday," he said, "the Aldrich Beaumont Foundation Gala. It's important." "How important?" she said. "One of the 3 negotiations is in its final stage," he said. "Beaumont is the pivot point. If I'm there with you and the presentation holds, it closes within the week." She looked at him steadily. "And if it doesn't close?" A pause. "Then the next 6 months becomes significantly more difficult." She looked back at her book. "I'll be ready at 7, she said. He stayed in the doorway for one more moment. She felt it, the weight of something he hadn't said, and then the sound of the wheels on the hardwood moving away. She turned the page without reading it. Friday came gray and cold, the sky the specific flat white of winter that contains no weather, just pressure. Camille dressed without Dara. She didn't need a stylist, she needed to control something, and this was something she could control. She chose the black gown from the wardrobe, the more formal one, with the high neckline that communicated nothing available. She did her own hair. She did not wear the perfume Mrs. Hargrove had placed on the dressing table. She wore the small amount of her own that she'd brought from her apartment, which smelled like cedar and something floral, and nothing designed by someone else's specifications. Small things, but hers. In the car, Lucien was quiet, which was not unusual, but the quality of the quiet was different, compressed, focused inward in a way that felt less like calm and more like a man running calculations under significant time pressure. "Beaumont," she said, "tell me what I need to know about him." Lucien looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. 63. Shipping and logistics on the surface. Below the surface, asset movement through holding structures in 4 jurisdictions. He's been a partner in several financial arrangements over the past decade that required significant trust on both sides. He paused. He was one of the people who needed to see me stable after the shooting. And is he satisfied? He was, Lucien said. There's been a complication. What kind? The kind that arrives with a woman named Seraphine Vale, he said. Camille went very still. She's been circulating, Lucien said. His voice was even, controlled, the way it was when he was angry at something he couldn't directly address. Since the reception, selectively. She's been sharing information with people whose confidence I need intact. Camille looked at the window. What kind of information, she said. The kind that calls into question the authenticity of the marriage. He paused. And my judgment. She met with me, Camille said. I know. She turned to look at him. How long have you known? Since Tuesday, he said. The day you went to the city. She held his gaze. You knew what she told me. I knew what she had to tell you, he said. The documentation exists. I knew she'd obtained it. And you didn't say anything. No. Why? His jaw tightened. Because there was nothing I could say that would have been the right thing to say. The car moved through the city. The streetlights were coming on. Camille sat with her hands in her lap and breathed and thought about the shape of what he'd just admitted. Not the deception, she'd expected that, but the moment at the dinner table when he'd looked at the floor before answering and understood that what she'd read as control had actually been something closer to dread. She didn't say anything else. The gala was at the Beaumont Foundation building, a glass tower in the financial district with a ballroom on the 42nd floor that looked out over the city in every direction. 300 guests, the kind of event where the money was so large it stopped being visible, where everything from the flowers to the catering to the light temperature had been calibrated to produce a specific register of ease in people for whom nothing was genuinely casual. They moved through it. Camille did what she was there to do, present, composed, present beside him with the specific quality of presence that communicated solidity rather than performance. Several people approached her directly, the wives and partners of men in Lucien's operational world, and she spoke to them with the same attentiveness she gave every patient, and she felt their assessment and she held under it because that was the job and she was good at her job. She spotted Beaumont at 40 minutes in. He was in the center of the room with 2 men she didn't recognize, late 60s, heavy through the shoulders, the kind of well-maintained large that suggested discipline rather than ease. He was watching the room with the attention of someone who had organized it. He was also watching Lucien. She couldn't read what the watching meant, and that bothered her. She stayed at Lucien's side when Beaumont crossed the room to them at the hour mark. The greeting was warm on Beaumont's side in the way of very controlled people being deliberately warm, and there were pleasantries that meant nothing, and then Beaumont said something that made the air in Camille's immediate vicinity change temperature. I was sorry to hear about the complications, Beaumont said to Lucien. I understand there have been some clarifications about the nature of your current arrangements. Lucien's expression did not change. I'm not sure what you've heard, Aldrich. I've heard enough to want to have a direct conversation, Beaumont said. His eyes moved briefly to Camille, not dismissively, but with the careful acknowledgement of a man who was deciding how much to include her in what he was saying. I wonder if we might find a quiet corner. Of course, Lucien said. He did not tell Camille to stay. He also did not tell her to come. He looked at her for half a second with something in his eyes that she read as, I'm sorry, and stay close, and don't react to whatever happens next, all at the same time, in half a second, with no words. She stayed where she was and held her glass and watched them move to a private lounge off the main room, a glass-walled space where she could see them and not hear them, and she watched two men sitting across from each other at a small table with the focused stillness of people negotiating over something important, and she watched Lucien's hands, flat on the table, controlled, the right one still as he managed it, and she watched Beaumont's face and read the conversation in its movements. It was not going well. She couldn't say how she knew. Beaumont was not demonstrative. He was the kind of man who delivered bad news in full sentences without raising his voice. But there was a point, approximately 12 minutes in, where Lucien's shoulders did something very small and specific. And Camille had learned enough about his body in 6 weeks to know that the small and specific thing meant he'd just received information he hadn't anticipated. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. When it ended, Beaumont stood first and offered his hand, and Lucien shook it, and Beaumont walked back into the room without looking at Camille, and Lucien sat in the glass-walled lounge for a moment alone before wheeling himself out. He came directly to her. "We need to leave," he said quietly. "What happened?" "In the car." She set her glass on a passing server's tray and followed him out. In the elevator down, he said nothing. In the car, he said nothing for the first 4 minutes, until the building was behind them and the city was moving past, and she turned to look at him directly and waited. "Seraphine gave Beaumont the documentation," he said. "The same document she gave me. More than that." His voice was controlled and completely flat. "She gave him the operational files, everything, the targeting profile, the financial structure behind the arrangement, the communications between my team during the assembly phase." He paused. "Beaumont considers the marriage fraudulent. He considers the evidence of the arrangement's construction to be evidence of a broader capacity for manufactured reality that makes me an unreliable partner." "He's pulling out," Camille said. "He's already pulled out." Lucien looked at the window. "He told me tonight as a professional courtesy because we have a 20-year history. The formal withdrawal comes Monday." She looked at his profile. "How significant is this?" "Beaumont is the hinge," he said. "When he moves, the others assess. 2 of the 3 negotiations will follow his lead within a week. And the third?" "The third was already fragile." The city moved past. She looked at her hands in her lap and thought about the scope of it. Not just the money, not just the deals, but what those deals represented. Stability, the proof of controlled function, the thing he'd needed her specifically to provide, which was the appearance of a man whose life was intact. "Seraphine Vale," she said. "Who is she to you?" A long pause. "She was a partner," he said, "several years ago. Operational. She managed a specific set of financial relationships across the European side of the network." "What happened?" Another pause. Longer. "I made a decision 3 years ago that redirected a significant portion of the operational infrastructure in a way that removed her from the central network," he said. "She considered it a removal. I considered it a restructuring. And she's been waiting." "Apparently." "She used me," Camille said. "It was an accusation. It was just the architecture of it, assembled in plain sight. She used what you built, the document, the protocol, as a weapon. She gave it to me to destabilize you, and then she gave it to Beaumont to finish the job." "Yes," he said, "and you knew she had the documentation. I knew she'd obtained it. I didn't know when she'd move or the direction. But you knew before you sent the initial envelope to my apartment," Camille said. "You knew there was someone with access to your operational files who was working against you." He turned to look at her. "Yes," he said. She held his gaze. "And you built the arrangement anyway?" "Yes." "Because the arrangement was meant to be completed before she could move." A pause. "Yes." She turned back to the window. She was breathing carefully and her hands were still, and she was doing the thing she did in triage when the situation had just become categorically worse, and there was still a patient in front of her, and the patient was what mattered, not her reaction to the situation. She did not know anymore who the patient was. They returned to the estate in silence. In the front hall, Lucien spoke quietly to Mrs. Hargrove, who listened and nodded and disappeared with the efficiency of someone taking instructions she understood were urgent. Camille went upstairs. She sat at the writing desk and unlocked the drawer and took out the folder and opened it and read the document again, this time looking for something specific: the timeline, the assembly dates, the names on the operational communications. The document was dated 18 months ago. Seraphine Vale was not mentioned in it anywhere. But the man who had signed the operational authorization, the name at the bottom of the engagement and retention protocol page, was not Lucien. It was someone named Casimir Dre. She stared at the name for a long time. She went downstairs. Lucien was in the study. The door was open, which was unusual, and he was at the desk with his phone to his ear, speaking in a low, rapid voice, and when he saw her in the doorway, he said something into the phone and ended the call. "Casimir Dre," she said. He went very still. "That's the signature on the protocol document," she said. "Not yours." He looked at her. "Who is he?" she said. Lucien set his phone down on the desk very carefully. "He was my head of strategic operations," he said. "For 9 years. Was. He died 8 months ago." He held her gaze. "He was the man who shot me." The room was very quiet. Camille stood in the doorway and let that land and felt it land and did not look away from him. "He built the protocol," she said. "He built the targeting architecture," Lucien said. "The profile, the assembly strategy, the timeline." He paused. "When I was shot, the operational infrastructure continued running on existing mandates. I was incapacitated for 11 weeks. The envelope reached you 4 weeks into my recovery, by which point Casimir was dead and the mandate was already in motion, and He stopped. "You let it run," she said. "I reviewed what he'd built and I let it run," he said. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at the desk, then back at her. "Because it was accurate," he said, and his voice had dropped, and the control in it was complete and tight, and costing him something she could feel from the doorway. "Everything he built around you was accurate. The profile was accurate. The assessment of who you were and what you needed and what you were capable of." He stopped again. "I had been shot in the back by someone I trusted completely, and I needed something real to hold to, and I looked at what Casimir had assembled and I thought, this one is real." The silence afterward was the kind that has weight. "You picked me because your dead operations chief built a file on me," she said. "I picked you because the file told me you were exactly the person I needed, and exactly the person I—" He stopped. His jaw was very tight. "Say it," she said. "The person I wanted to know," he said. Quiet. Stripped of everything. She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe. The wood was cold and solid, and she needed something solid. "Lucien," she said, "I need you to understand what you're describing." "I know what I'm describing." "Do you?" She looked at him directly. "You are describing a man who, after being shot, after losing the use of his legs and watching his operational world fracture, decided to reconstruct his life around a woman whose psychological profile had been built by the man who tried to kill him. You let that man's last project become your blueprint for a marriage." He said nothing. "You don't see how that is the most frightening thing you have ever told anyone," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I see it. And you did it anyway." "Yes." She let go of the doorframe. She turned around. She walked back upstairs and into her room and closed the door and stood in the center of the room with her arms at her sides and breathed. The man who had tried to kill Lucien Veloro had also, in the process, designed her. Not metaphorically. Not operationally. Casimir Dre had sat somewhere, in an office, at a desk, in front of a screen, and mapped the interior of her life with sufficient precision that Lucien had looked at the result 9 months later and thought, this one is real. As if the realness of her were something Casimir had manufactured alongside the targeting coordinates. As if the woman Camille Arden actually had been revealed by an assassin's research and then curated by a dying man's last operational mandate. She sat on the floor. Not the bed. The floor because the floor was low and solid, and the bed was where she slept, and she could not be in the place where she slept right now. She thought about her grandmother's hands. She thought about the dialysis center and the coordinator's warm voice and the preliminary evaluation and the transplant board. She thought about the envelope with her name in black ink and the cold voice on the phone and 47 pages of contract language in 6 months and the number 64 in a checking account. She thought about midnight blue and a man standing up in a ballroom under unbearable cost. She thought about Seraphine Vale's face, the precise smile, the card placed on the bar beside the water glass, the way she'd said come or don't, with the confidence of someone who already knew which choice would be made. Seraphine had not given her the document out of altruism or even out of calculated damage to Lucien. Seraphine had given her the document because she understood that Camille Arden was the most efficiently destructive force available to her, that a woman who discovered she'd been profiled and placed would do more damage to Lucien's stability than any financial withdrawal, because Camille was the only element of his life that was not covered by a contingency plan. She was the variable Casimir Dre had built and Seraphine Vale had detonated. She got up off the floor. She unlocked the drawer and took out the folder and looked at it for a moment and then carried it downstairs. Lucien was still in the study. He hadn't moved. He was at the desk in the low light, and his phone was in his hand, but he wasn't looking at it. And when she came in, he looked up, and the expression on his face was the gymnasium floor expression, the one she'd seen for 3 seconds before the mask came back. Except this time it didn't go anywhere. This time he let it stay. She set the folder on his desk. "I need you to tell me what Seraphine actually wants," she said. "Not the financial picture, not the negotiations. What is the specific thing she is trying to achieve?" He looked at the folder. "Control of the Eastern Distribution Network," he said. "The restructuring 3 years ago handed it to a separate management trust. If my position becomes sufficiently unstable, if the financial partners withdraw and the operational authority is questioned, the trust reverts to open governance. She's positioned to acquire it. How much is it worth? Operationally, the network handles approximately 400 million annually. And how long does she have before the position stabilizes again? If Beaumont follows through Monday and the others move by end of week," he paused. "Approximately 10 days. 10 days, Camille repeated. "Yes." She stood in front of his desk and looked at the folder and looked at him and thought about 10 days and thought about the real trap. The one she'd identified on the terrace, the gap between engineering and truth, and understood that the trap had not been set by Lucien or by Casimir Dre or by Seraphine Vale. The trap had been the moment she'd put on the coat, not because the coat was manipulation, because it had fit. "What do you need from me?" she said. He looked at her. "Camille, I'm not asking for your sake," she said. "I'm asking because Seraphine Vale used me as a weapon against you, and I am not a weapon and I don't intend to perform that function. What do you need?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I need 3 meetings in the next 10 days, he said. "Beaumont and the 2 others. I need the presentation to hold under sustained scrutiny from people who have now seen the documentation. I need you to stand beside me in front of men who know what the protocol document says and to make the marriage look real." She looked at him steadily. "And is it?" she said. "Real." He held her gaze for a long time. The low lamp, the quiet room, the folder on the desk between them. "The part that's mine is," he said. She breathed. "All right," she said. "Tell me everything you know about each of these 3 men. Not the financial picture, the human one. What they want, what they fear. What makes them believe something is genuine rather than performed." He blinked once. Then he picked up a pen and opened a notepad and began to talk. And she sat across from him in the study chair and listened with the full specific attention she gave to everything that mattered. And outside the estate grounds were frozen and still. And somewhere in the city, Seraphine Vale was waiting for 10 days to run out. And somewhere across the city, in a dialysis center, Edna Arden was sleeping under a warm blanket with her kidneys at 11% and her name on a private transplant track. And somewhere in the locked drawer upstairs was a document with the words, "Subject Arden," at the top in institutional typeface. And in a study in the East Wing, a man who had been built into a weapon by his own assassin, and a woman who had been built into a wife by that same dead hand sat across from each other in lamplight and worked. Not for the arrangement, not for the contract, because somewhere between the gymnasium floor and the 47 pages and the midnight blue gown and 3 seconds of exposed truth, something had grown in the architecture around them that was not in any document. And Seraphine Vale had 10 days, and they had each other. And neither of them was entirely sure what that meant yet. But Camille Arden had stopped asking whether the feeling was real, and started asking what it required of her. And that, she understood as she listened to Lucien describe three men she had never met in a world she had never inhabited, was the moment she stopped surviving the arrangement and started fighting for something she couldn't fully name. The folder stayed on the desk between them all night. Neither of them touched it again. They worked until 2 a.m. Camille filled 4 pages of the notepad with handwritten notes. Not the financial structures, not the operational language, but the human cartography of 3 men. What Lucien knew of their families, their histories, the specific textures of what each of them considered trustworthy. She asked questions he hadn't expected her to ask and wrote down answers in the compressed shorthand of someone who had learned to take notes in moving situations where every second of attention mattered. At 2 a.m., Lucien stopped mid-sentence and looked at her. "You need to sleep," he said. "So do you." "I don't sleep much." "I know," she said. "You should anyway." He looked at the notepad in front of her. She had covered both sides of 3 pages in handwriting that was small and dense and completely legible. He looked at it the way he looked at things that surprised him, with a stillness that was not quite controlled. "You're not doing this for the contract," he said. She capped her pen. "No." "Then what?" She looked at him across the desk. The lamp between them was the only light in the room, and it made the shadows long and specific. "Seraphine Vale decided I was a detonator," she said. "She handed me a document and pointed me at you and waited for the explosion." She set the pen down. "I don't like being used, not by you and not by her." He said nothing. "And I made a decision in this room tonight," she said, "which is that whatever the document says, whatever the protocol was, whatever Casimir Dre built and you inherited, the 10 days in front of us are mine. I'm not going to let her win with my body." He looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said, very quiet. She picked up the notepad and went upstairs and slept 4 hours and woke before the alarm and went back downstairs and found him already in the study, already on the phone, already 3 moves ahead of a crisis that had not finished arriving. The next 8 days had the specific density of time under pressure. Hours that compressed and expanded unpredictably, the way they do when everything is contingent on everything else, and the margin for error is narrow enough to feel physical. Day 1 was Beaumont. Lucien arranged a private breakfast, not at a neutral location, at the estate, which was a deliberate choice Camille had suggested the night before. "His ground," she'd said. "Let them come to you. Withdrawal happens on neutral territory. People who come to your house are still deciding." Beaumont arrived at 8 with one associate, a thin man named Carlyle, who said nothing and watched everything. Camille met them at the door in the charcoal coat, her coat, the one that fit, and shook Beaumont's hand and looked directly at him and said, "Thank you for coming, Aldrich," and used his first name because she'd decided on it specifically, and the decision landed exactly as she'd calculated, a small domestic warmth that was not performed because she'd made herself feel it first. Over breakfast, she did not perform the marriage. She performed nothing. She talked to Beaumont about his foundation. She'd read the annual report the night before, all 40 pages of it, and she asked about the pediatric literacy program in the 3rd-tier cities because it was genuinely interesting and because it was the thing in the report that had clearly been personal rather than strategic. Beaumont looked at her with the careful attention of a man recalibrating. Carlyle watched her and said nothing. When the conversation moved to business, when Beaumont looked at Lucien with the careful eyes of someone who had seen the documentation and was deciding what weight to give it, Camille did the thing she had decided the night before she would do. She stayed at the table. She did not excuse herself. She did not create the polite distance that would have communicated, "This is not my territory." She sat with her coffee and her notepad, and she listened, and her presence in the room said, without words, "I know what the document says, and I'm still here." Beaumont noticed. She felt him notice. The slight shift in his reading of the room, the reassessment. The breakfast lasted 2 hours. Beaumont did not reverse his decision at the table. But when he stood to leave, he shook Lucien's hand and then turned to Camille and said, "Your grandmother's evaluation. Lucien mentioned it's progressing well." "It is," she said. "Thank you for asking." "My wife had a long illness," Beaumont said, "before she passed." He looked at Camille steadily. "The people who stay are worth knowing." He left. In the hallway afterward, Lucien looked at her. "He'll call by Thursday," she said. "You don't know that." "He looked at me the way people look at something they're deciding to trust," she said. I know that look. Lucien was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, you do. Beaumont called Wednesday. He did not formally re-enter the negotiation. He told Lucien that his withdrawal was being reconsidered and that he would want one additional meeting before the end of the week. Lucien's voice on the phone was controlled and even, and when the call ended, he sat in the study with the phone on the desk and said nothing for a moment, and Camille, who was in the chair across from him going through notes, looked up and caught his expression. The expression was not victory. It was something more fractured and quieter than that. 2 more, she said. 2 more, he confirmed. The second meeting was with a man named Prentice Lowe, younger than Beaumont, mid-50s, sharp in the way of someone who had built rather than inherited. He was the most skeptical of the three and the one whose withdrawal would be loudest. He had, according to Lucien, specifically mentioned the protocol document in his communication, which meant he'd received it from Seraphine with context rather than just documentation. That meeting was harder. It was held at Lowe's offices in the city, which was his ground and his choice, and Camille felt the difference immediately. The room arranged to communicate authority. The assistant who brought water and didn't offer anything else. The way Lowe stood when they entered and shook Lucien's hand with the minimal warmth of someone who hadn't decided yet how much warmth to offer. Lowe looked at Camille with the direct assessing gaze of someone who had already formed a hypothesis and was testing it. "Mrs. Veloro," he said. "Mr. Lowe," she said. "I understand you have concerns." He blinked once. He hadn't expected directness. "I have questions," he said carefully. "About the marriage," she said. "About the circumstances of the marriage," he said. She sat down without being invited to, which was also deliberate, and she put her hands flat on the table and looked at him and said, "The circumstances are exactly what Seraphine Vale told you they were. The initial arrangement was structured. I was identified and approached. I signed a contract." She held his gaze. "That is all true." Lowe looked at Lucien. "She's aware," Lucien said. "I was the subject of the targeting protocol," Camille said. "I've read the document. I know what it says." She let that sit for a moment. "What I can tell you is that I'm still here, not because of the contract. The contract gave me an exit. I didn't take it." She looked at Lowe steadily. "What you're trying to assess is whether Lucien Veloro is someone whose judgment you can trust. I can't tell you what to conclude about his business judgment, but I can tell you that a man who builds something calculated and then falls genuinely is still a man capable of the real thing." "Paso jatem." Lowe was quiet. "That's a significant claim from someone with a financial incentive," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She paused. "I'm a nurse. I've sat with people in the worst hours of their lives for 12 years. I know the difference between someone performing and someone bleeding." She looked at him. "Lucien Veloro is not performing." The meeting lasted 90 minutes. Lowe did not commit. But at the door, he told his assistant to hold his Thursday calls, which Camille, from years of reading the signals of people who were deciding things, understood as the specific administrative behavior of a man who was planning to make a phone call he didn't want interrupted. In the car back, Lucien said, "You told him I fall genuinely." "You do." Silence. "Camille, not now," she said, not harshly, just firmly. "After." He was quiet the rest of the way back. The third meeting was the one she hadn't expected. His name was Dante Reyes, 58, South American by origin, operating across 3 continents in logistics and financial infrastructure that was significantly less surface than Beaumont's or Lowe's. Lucien had described him as the quietest of the 3 and the most dangerous to lose, because Reyes's confidence functioned as a signal. The other members of the broader network watched where Reyes put his weight and adjusted accordingly. Reyes did not agree to a meeting. On day 5, Lucien received a message from Reyes's representative that said simply, "DR is not available for meeting at this time. Monitoring." Lucien told Camille this at dinner, and she looked at her plate and thought, "He's watching Beaumont and Lowe," she said. "Yes. So if they move, he moves. If they move in the right direction. Then Reyes isn't the problem," she said. "Seraphine is." Lucien looked at her. "If Seraphine is still circulating information," Camille said, Then Beaumont and Low stabilizing doesn't fully matter because she'll find another angle before the 10 days run out. What does she actually need? Not ultimately, immediately. What's the specific mechanism she's waiting for? He was quiet. The trust governance clause activates if I miss the quarterly operational confirmation, he said. It's a standing requirement, a formal declaration of operational authority submitted to the trust board. If it's not submitted in the current window, the board can initiate open governance proceedings. When is the window? It closes Friday at 5 p.m. She looked at him. Today is Wednesday. Yes. And is the declaration ready? A pause. The declaration requires a co-signature from the operational director, he said. That position has been vacant since Casimir. Camille set down her fork. You don't have an operational director. No. Because the last one shot you. Yes. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Not distress. Calculation. She was running something in her mind and he could see it running. Who has signatory authority if the position is vacant? Under the original trust instrument, a senior partner can co-sign if the position is vacant, and the board approves the substitution in advance. He paused. The board approval requires a motion, a 48-hour notice period, and a quorum. Can you get a quorum by tomorrow morning? Possibly. Then file the motion tonight, she said. Who's your most reliable board member? Eleanor Vance. She's been with the trust for 15 years. Call her now. Camille picked up her fork. Then tell me what a senior partner co-signature would require of the person signing it. He looked at her for a long moment. Camille, he said. What you're suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet, she said. I'm gathering information. Call Eleanor Vance. He called Eleanor Vance. Vance was 71 years old and had the voice of someone who had been in consequential rooms for 5 decades and found most urgency to be manageable. She listened to Lucien's explanation of the situation and the co-signature mechanism and was quiet for a moment. Who's the proposed co-signatory? She said. Lucien looked at Camille. Camille Veloro, he said. A pause on the line. She's your wife, Vance said. Yes. Is she a senior partner in any capacity? She would need to be formally designated, Lucien said, which requires a board resolution, which requires the 48-hour notice period and a quorum. Another pause. File the motion in the next 2 hours and I'll make the calls. I can have a quorum by 7 a.m. Thursday. Her voice was dry and efficient. I'll need her background documentation. You'll have it, Lucien said. He ended the call and looked at Camille. What I'm asking you to do, he said carefully, is to formally enter the operational structure of a trust that manages assets connected to activities that are legally ambiguous, she said. In some areas. I know what you are, she said. I've known since before I came here. She looked at him steadily. You said you're dismantling the parts that produce the violence, are you? He didn't look away. Yes. Then I need to believe that's true, she said. And I need you to understand that if I do this and it turns out not to be true, I will be a significantly more dangerous problem for you than Seraphine Vale. He looked at her. Yes, he said, very quiet. I know. She gave a single nod. File the motion. Thursday morning at 7:15, the board quorum was confirmed. At 7:40, Eleanor Vance called back and said the resolution had passed. At 8 a.m., Camille sat at the desk in the study across from a trust attorney she'd never met before and read 30 pages of documentation with the same focused attention she'd given the original contract, and she asked 4 specific questions that made the attorney look at Lucien with an expression Camille interpreted as cautious respect, and then she signed her name, Camille Veloro. The pen was heavy, and the signature was her own, and the choice was entirely hers, and she felt the weight of it settle into her spine in a way that was not frightening, exactly, but permanent. They had until 5 p.m. Friday to file the quarterly confirmation. At 9 a.m. Thursday, Seraphine Vale called Lucien's direct line. Camille was in the room. She watched Lucien answer and hold the phone to his ear and say nothing for a moment, just listening. And the expression on his face during the listening was the controlled neutralization face, the flat, managed anger, except underneath it something else was moving that she'd only seen once before. He put the call on speaker, suggesting, Seraphine was saying, that you reconsider the filing. Vance's quorum was barely legal, and you know it. I have 3 board members who will contest the resolution if the confirmation goes through with an unauthorized co-signature. The co-signature is authorized, Lucien said. The resolution passed. Lucien. Seraphine's voice was precise and patient, in the way of someone who had been waiting a long time for a specific conversation and had prepared for it thoroughly. You know what I'm asking. Don't file the confirmation and I walk away from the network claim. You keep the Eastern distribution, you restructure the board, and you move on. Whatever you've built with your arranged wife, you build it somewhere that doesn't cost you everything else. No, Lucien said. A pause. Think about what you're protecting, Seraphine said. I know what I'm protecting. Do you? Her voice changed. Something in it sharpened, and Camille felt the change before she understood it. I spoke with Edna Arden on Tuesday. The room went cold. Camille's hand closed on the edge of the desk. She's a lovely woman, Seraphine said. Remarkable, really, given her condition. We had quite a long conversation at the dialysis center. She mentioned her granddaughter. She mentioned this marriage. Another pause. She doesn't know very much about Lucien Veloro, does she? Camille's voice came out completely flat. What did you say to her? I told her I was a friend, Seraphine said. I didn't say anything alarming. Yet. The word landed with precise, deliberate weight. The transplant evaluation is at a delicate stage. These things can be disrupted in ways that are very difficult to trace. Camille stood up. She crossed the room in 4 steps and took the phone from Lucien's hand. Seraphine, she said. Her voice was not loud. It was the voice she used when things were very bad and very clear, and the only useful thing was forward motion. If you contact my grandmother again, or if anything disrupts her medical process in any way I can trace to you, I will take everything I know about your network position, your asset acquisition strategy, and the specific documentation you shared with Beaumont and Lowe, and I will give it to people whose interest in that information is significantly less manageable than Lucien. A silence. That's an interesting threat from a nurse, Seraphine said. I'm not threatening, Camille said. I'm describing what will happen. There's a difference. Another silence. Longer. You've learned his vocabulary, Seraphine said. I've been paying attention, Camille said. Don't contact my grandmother again. She ended the call. She set the phone on the desk. Her hand was steady, and her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in the base of her throat, and she stood there for a moment with her palm flat on the desk and breathed through it. Lucien was looking at her. She won't touch Edna, she said. That was a test. She wanted to know if I was the weak point. She has the answer. You don't know. Yes, I do. She looked at him. She's been running this the whole time as an information campaign. The moment it becomes something physical, the exposure becomes unmanageable for her. She knows that. She picked up the phone and called the dialysis center and confirmed Edna's session for that afternoon and told the coordinator to flag any unusual contacts and to call Camille directly for anything outside the standard care protocol. The coordinator confirmed everything. Edna was fine. Edna was watching a cooking program and had eaten lunch. Camille put the phone down. She realized her legs were not fully stable. She sat down. Lucien was very still across the desk from her. He was looking at her with the expression that had no strategy in it. The face from the gymnasium floor, the face from the terrace, the face that was just him, whatever was underneath all the architecture. Camille, he said. Not yet, she said. She held up one hand. She needed a moment. Just a moment to let the adrenaline settle from emergency into something manageable. To let her body understand that it had done the thing and the thing was done and the immediate danger was navigated. She breathed in, out, 4 counts, 8 counts. The room was quiet. All right, she said. She lowered her hand. Lucien was still looking at her with the unmanaged face. You said not yet, he said. Yes. What's yet? He said. She looked at him across the desk. The study was quiet, the morning light coming through at a low angle. The folder that had been on the desk for days finally moved to the shelf where it belonged. She looked at him and thought about what she was about to say. Not because she wasn't sure of it, but because she wanted to say it correctly, without performance or architecture or the vocabulary of a protocol designed by a dead man. Yet is after Friday at 5:01 p.m., she said. After the confirmation is filed and the trust governance is settled and the window closes. He was quiet. And then, he said, and then we're going to have the conversation we've been not having since I came back inside from the terrace, she said, about what is real and what was built and whether those things are actually different. He looked at her for a long time. They're not different, he said. It came out quiet and certain and undefended, and it hit her in the center of her chest with the force of something she'd been waiting to hear and hadn't known she was waiting for. She held it. File the confirmation, she said. Let's finish this first. He nodded. He turned to the desk, and at exactly that moment, his phone rang again. Not his direct line. The secondary number, the one she'd never heard ring before, the one with the different tone that she'd asked about once, and he'd said was for operational escalation. He looked at the screen. Something happened in his face. What? She said. He answered without speaking, just listening, and she watched the blood drain from his face in the specific way it drains from the faces of people who have just received information that has changed the shape of everything. And she thought, not now, not today, not when we are 12 hours from... He put the phone down. He looked at her. There's been a complication with the dialysis, he said. His voice was completely wrong. Stripped down to nothing, no control left, just the words and what was underneath them. Your grandmother's dialysis circuit failed 20 minutes ago during her session. She's in the ICU. Camille stood up. The room was still, and the study was quiet, and the confirmation document was on the desk unsigned, and the clock was running toward Friday 5 p.m., and Edna Arden was in the ICU, and Camille Arden stood in the center of the study at the Veloro estate. And she was already moving before the last word left his mouth. Coat, bag, keys to... No keys. The car was already being pulled around. She could hear it, which meant Lucien had called downstairs before he'd finished telling her, which meant he had done it in the same breath as the news, and she registered that detail with the part of her brain that registered everything and filed it without processing it, because processing it required time she didn't have. The hallway, the stairs, the front door. Lucien was behind her and then beside her, and then she heard the wheels on the gravel and turned, and he was already outside, already in the cold without a coat, his jaw set, and his eyes on the car pulling up, and his phone against his ear, again speaking in a low, rapid voice she didn't have the bandwidth to parse. She got in. He got in beside her. The car moved. The city came back in pieces, the familiar streets assembling themselves outside the window in the gray February light, and Camille sat with both hands in her lap and breathed with the deliberate steadiness of someone performing a technical function, because the alternative was to stop breathing steadily, and she could not afford the alternative. Not yet. Not until she knew. What exactly happened? She said. Her voice was even. She hated how even it was. The dialysis circuit failure caused a pressure event, Lucien said. He was still on his phone, but the call had ended. He was reading something. She lost consciousness during the session. They stabilized her on site and transferred to St. Mercy ICU. He looked at her. She's alive, Camille. She nodded. The nod cost her something. Her vitals when the transfer completed were, he read from the screen, blood pressure low but stable, oxygen saturation at 91 and improving. They have her on supplemental. The attending is Dr. Vieira. She specializes in renal ICU management, Camille said. I know Vieira. She's good. Yes. Camille looked at this window. They were crossing the bridge now, the river below them gray and flat, and completely indifferent to the morning. She thought about dialysis circuit failures. She knew the mechanism. She'd seen two in her career, Sham, one that resolved cleanly and one that hadn't. And she knew the variables, and she knew that 91% oxygen saturation after transfer was not a disaster number, not yet, and she held on to that number with both hands. Seraphine, she said, I don't know yet. Find out. I have people. Find out, she said again. Still even, still technical. If this was her, I need to know before we walk into that hospital. He made a call. She watched the city and counted her own heartbeats the way she'd counted things in hard situations her whole life. Not to calm herself, just to have something to count, because counting meant time was passing, and time was the thing she needed most right now. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Lucien set the phone down. The dialysis center uses a maintenance contractor, he said. The circuit component that failed was serviced 3 days ago. The contractor has a secondary relationship with a logistics firm that handles equipment procurement for a holding company under Seraphine's network. The car was very quiet. "It's not proof," he said. "The chain is too long for direct attribution." "I know," Camille said. "Camille, I know." She turned to look at him. Her eyes were completely dry and completely clear. "It doesn't matter right now. Right now, Edna is what matters." She held his gaze for 1 second. "But I need you to understand that after, when Edna is stable and the confirmation is filed and everything that needs to be resolved is resolved, I'm going to need Seraphine Vale to be finished, not relocated, not restructured, finished." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I'm not asking you how," she said. "I'm telling you what I need." "I understand." She looked back at the window. St. Mercy came into view on the left. The building she'd worked in for 4 years, the place that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, and the specific staleness of a place that never fully slept. And she saw it now from the outside, from the wrong seat, from the position she'd sat with 100 families in 100 waiting rooms and tried to give enough information to hold them upright without giving them more than they could carry. She knew exactly how this felt from the outside now. The car stopped. She got out before it finished stopping. The ICU waiting area on the 4th floor was where she'd spent more hours than she could count on the other side of the glass. And she walked to the nurse's station and identified herself, and a charge nurse she'd worked with twice before, a woman named Torres, looked up and said Camille, with the particular softness of someone who understood which side of the glass she was on today. "She's stable," Torres said immediately. "Vera is with her." "Can I give her 10 minutes?" Torres said. "She'll come out." Camille stood at the nurse's station and waited, and 10 minutes had never been a longer unit of time in her entire life. She stood with her hands in the pockets of the charcoal coat and her shoulders level and her face composed, and she felt Lucien stop beside her without looking at him, and she was grateful, with a specific and inarticulate gratitude that he didn't speak. Dr. Vieira came out at 11 minutes, mid-50s, direct, the kind of fatigue that had been worn long enough to become invisible. "She's stable," Vera said. "The pressure event caused a brief cardiac irregularity. We've got her on monitoring. Kidneys they're where they were. Not significantly worse." She looked at Camille steadily. "The circuit failure was mechanical. I've requested a full review of the equipment." "I need her moved," Camille said. Vera looked at her. "I need her transferred to a private facility," Camille said. "Tonight if possible, tomorrow morning at the latest. Somewhere the equipment provenance is fully audited and the access protocol is restricted." Vera was quiet for a moment. She glanced once at Lucien, briefly, the assessment of a person taking in context. Then she looked back at Camille. "I can arrange a transfer to Harmon Private Medical. They have renal ICU capacity and their maintenance contracts are internal." She paused. "It's not a standard request." "Nothing about this is standard," Camille said. "Please start the paperwork." Vera nodded and went back through the doors. Camille turned to Lucien. "Harmon Private will need—" "It's already covered," he said. "The trust arrangement extends to facility transfers." She looked at him. "I called ahead when we were in the car," he said quietly. "Before you asked." She looked at him for a long moment. There was a version of this moment where she said something, acknowledged it, named it, let it be what it was. She wasn't in that version yet. She was still in the version where Edna was behind a glass door and the clock was running toward Friday 5 p.m. and Seraphine Vale was somewhere in the city having made a calculation that Camille intended to make catastrophically wrong. "Thank you," she said. She went in to see Edna. Her grandmother was smaller in the hospital bed than she was in Camille's memory, which always happened. The reduction that occurred when the person you loved most was placed in an institutional context where everything was sized for the average, and Edna was not the average. Edna was specifically and irreducibly herself, 73 pounds of will and stubbornness, and the kind of love that doesn't negotiate. She was awake. Her eyes found Camille's immediately, and something in her face settled. The specific settling of a person whose primary concern had been someone else's worry, not their own condition. "You didn't have to come," Edna said. Her voice was rough but present. "Stop," Camille said. She sat down and took Edna's hand, papery and warm, exactly as remembered, exactly as permanent, and held it without squeezing because the IV site was on the back, and she'd learned a long time ago where not to press. "I'm fine," Edna said. "You're in the ICU. I've been in worse places. You haven't." Edna looked at her with the particular expression she reserved for moments when Camille was technically correct and emotionally intractable. Then her eyes moved to the window in the door, and Camille followed her gaze and saw Lucien in the hallway, visible through the glass, parked outside the door, not looking in because he'd positioned himself specifically not to intrude. "That's him," Edna said. "Yes." "He came himself." "Yes." Edna was quiet for a moment, looking at the window. "The woman who came to the center," she said. "Tuesday." Camille went still. "What did she say to you?" "She said she was a friend of his," Edna said. "She asked if I was happy about the marriage." She paused. "She was looking for something to use. I could tell." She looked at Camille with the clear, undeceived gaze of a woman who had been reading people from necessity for 70 years. "I told her my granddaughter makes her own choices, and that was the end of the conversation." Camille pressed her forehead briefly to Edna's hand. "Camille," Edna said, "is he good to you?" The question was specific and without qualification, and it required a specific and unqualified answer. "He's trying to be," Camille said. Edna was quiet. "That's the right answer," she said finally. "The ones who are already good don't work as hard." Camille stayed for 40 minutes. When she came out, Lucien was still in the hallway, and he looked at her and she looked at him. And the look between them was long and plain and contained everything that had been building since a code appeared on a kitchen counter at 2 a.m. 6 weeks ago, and neither of them said anything, and it was enough. They went back to the estate. The confirmation document was on the desk where they'd left it. It was 1:47 p.m. The window closed at 5 p.m. Friday. They had until then. Camille sat at the desk and picked up the pen. "Wait," Lucien said. She looked up. He had something in his hand. A folder. Not the protocol folder. A different one. Thinner, bound with a clip. He set it on the desk in front of her. "Before you sign anything else," he said, "I want you to read this." She looked at it. "What is it?" "It's the operational dismantlement schedule," he said. "The Eastern Distribution Network. The parts that move what I told you I was moving away from. The timeline. The asset redirections. The legal restructuring." He held her gaze. "I started it 4 months before you arrived. Before the arrangement. Before Casimir." He paused. "I want you to know it existed independent of you." She looked at the folder. She picked it up and opened it and read it. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to see the dates, enough to see the specific operational language of something being genuinely unwound rather than cosmetically restructured. Enough to see the legal annotations in the margins in Lucien's compact handwriting that indicated not a man performing reform, but a man doing the slow, difficult work of it. She closed the folder. She signed the confirmation document. At 4:43 p.m. on Friday, Lucien submitted the quarterly operational confirmation to the trust board with Camille Veloro's co-signature. Eleanor Vance confirmed receipt at 4:51. At 5:03, the governance window closed. At 5:47, Prentice Lowe called and formally re-entered the negotiation. At 6:12, Edna Arden was transferred to Harmon Private Medical. At 7:30, Beaumont's office sent a written confirmation of his recommitment to the partnership. And at 9 p.m., Lucien's secondary phone, the escalation number, rang one last time. He answered it, listened, said 3 words: "Confirm and proceed." Ended the call. Camille looked at him. "Seraphine," he said. "She's withdrawing her network claim, formally, in writing, through Voss's office." He paused. "She's agreed to a full operational exit in exchange for a clean settlement." "What changed?" Camille said. "Reyes," he said. "Dante Reyes called her this afternoon and told her that if she proceeded, the information she'd used against us would be redirected in a direction she would find significantly more problematic." He paused. "He did it without being asked." Camille stared at him. "Reyes came in on his own. Apparently, he decided." Lucien's expression was not quite readable. Something in it that was tired and surprised, and something else she didn't have a clean name for yet. He told my representative, a man whose wife fights like that is worth the investment. The room was quiet. Camille set down her glass. It's over, she said. Yes, he said. She sat with that for a moment. The word over and what it meant and what it didn't mean, and the shape of the silence after a sustained emergency when the emergency ends and the body doesn't know what to do with the quiet. The 6 months, she said, how long is left? He looked at her steadily. 11 weeks. 11 weeks, she repeated. Yes. She stood up. She walked to the window, the study window, the one that overlooked the east garden where the fountain was dry and the hedges were winter stripped and everything was the flat gray-brown of February waiting to be done. She stood there with her hands at her sides and looked at the dark garden and thought about 11 weeks and thought about what came after 11 weeks and thought about a conversation she'd told him they would have when everything was finished. Everything was finished. She turned around. He was watching her from the desk with the unmanaged face, the gymnasium floor face, the terrace face, the face that was only Lucien, not the man who ran the empire, or held the wheelchair, or signed the documents, or managed the room. Just him. I want to talk about what's real, she said. He was very still. Not the contract, she said, not the document, not what Casimir built, or what you inherited, or what Seraphine turned into a weapon. She looked at him directly. I want to talk about what's actually here, between us, what we actually are. He didn't speak for a moment. The lamp was low and the house was quiet and outside the winter garden was dark. I don't know how to do that, he said, without the architecture. I know, she said. Neither do I. She walked back to the chair across from his desk and sat down. But I think we should try anyway. He looked at her. The tea, he said finally. The first night you couldn't sleep. Yes. That wasn't in the document, he said. I mean that Rosalind knew your preference because it was in the procurement file, but he stopped, started again. I went downstairs at midnight because I knew you weren't sleeping, and the knowing wasn't operational intelligence. I just knew. And I made the tea myself because Rosalind was off, and because I wanted to do it myself. And I couldn't tell you that, so I left a note and went back upstairs. She looked at him. You made it yourself, she said. Yes. Lucien Veloro made chamomile tea at midnight. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that lived near a smile in someone who had spent a long time without access to one. It was not my most operationally sound decision, he said. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not release, not yet, but the beginning of release, the loosening that precedes it. The coat, she said. I saw you in the garden that first morning, he said. Without one. You stayed out for 40 minutes in February like you were daring the cold to be the thing that finally stopped you. He paused. I thought, she's been doing that her whole life, daring things to stop her. He looked at his hands. The coat felt like, I wanted her to be warm, that was all. There was nothing calculated about wanting her to be warm. She looked at him for a long time. And the wedding, she said. He was quiet. You could have stayed in the chair, she said. The wedding was for the guests, for the presentation, you standing up. That wasn't for them. No, he said. Who was it for? He looked at her, the lamp between them, the quiet house. It was for you, he said, because you were walking toward me and you deserved to be met as an equal, and I was not going to let you walk the length of that room to a man sitting down. His voice was controlled and low and completely without strategy. I knew it would cost me 2 days of physical recovery. I did it anyway. Camille felt her eyes get hot. She did not let them get further than hot. I need to tell you something, she said. All right. I knew, she said. From the beginning, not the document. I didn't know about the document, but I knew something was being constructed around me. I felt it. She held his gaze. And I told myself it was proximity and circumstance, and I let myself feel it anyway because she stopped, breathed, because I was so tired of being the person who couldn't afford to feel anything. And you were the first thing in a long time that felt like it was actually about me, not my function, me. He was very still. I know that's what the engineering was designed to produce, she said. I know the warmth was built to feel personal, But somewhere between knowing that and being in it, the line disappeared. She looked at him steadily. I'm not telling you the manipulation didn't happen. It did. I'm telling you that what's here now. She pressed her hand flat on the desk. This is mine. I built this. You didn't engineer this part. I chose this. He looked at her hand on the desk. He reached out and placed his hand over hers. Not performance, not strategy, just the weight of his hand on hers, the right hand with its imperfect sensation and its managed stillness, laid over her fingers in the lamplight of a study in a house that had been designed to feel like a fortress and had become, somewhere between February and now, something she didn't have a better word for than home. I'm not going to be easy, he said. I don't know how to be easy. I know, she said. And this, he exhaled. What I am, what the network is, the dismantlement, it's slow. It will take years. It won't be clean. I know that too. You're a nurse, he said. You work overnight shifts. You have a grandmother you love and debt you're climbing out of and a life that was entirely your own before the envelope arrived. He paused. I'm not going to pretend I'm not asking you to make this your life too. She looked at their hands on the desk. You're not asking me anything, she said. I'm deciding. The silence after that was the longest one. Not pressurized, not dense with unresolved things, just long and quiet, and full of the particular texture of two people sitting with a truth that had cost them both a great deal to reach. Outside, something changed in the winter garden. She noticed it first, the light, the quality of it shifting, and then the sound, faint through the old stone walls, the sound of water moving. She looked at the window. The fountain, she said. Lucien turned to look. The fountain in the east garden, the one that had been dry and leaf-filled since she arrived, was running, a thin arc of water catching the terrace lights, the basin filling slowly, the sound of it just audible through the glass. I asked the groundskeeper to turn it on this week, he said. She looked at him. When? She said. Tuesday, he said, after Vance's call, after you signed the trust designation. He was looking at the window and not at her. It seemed like... He stopped. It seemed like the right time for the water to come back. She looked at the fountain for a long time. She thought about the day she'd stood in this garden and stared at that same dry basin and wondered whether she had ruined her life. She thought about the envelope and the contract and 47 pages and midnight blue and 3 seconds on a gymnasium floor. She thought about Edna's hands and the word subject in institutional typeface and a woman named Seraphine who had miscalculated what kind of person she was dealing with. She thought about $64 in a checking account and the specific weight of debt that had stopped feeling like money and started feeling like weather, permanent and environmental, something she moved through rather than something she could resolve. She thought about what it meant that the fountain was running, not as symbol, as fact. Someone had decided the water should come back and had acted on that decision. And the fountain was running because of a decision made by a man who was not accustomed to making decisions that had no operational purpose. She stood up. She walked to the study door and turned around. Come outside, she said. He looked at her. The fountain's running, she said. Come outside. He came outside. The garden was cold and clear, the air sharp with the particular cleanness of late winter, and the fountain was thin and steady in the basin, the water catching the terrace light and moving patterns across the stone. They stood beside it, Camille standing, Lucien beside her in the chair, the two of them in the dark garden with the house warm and lit behind them. She looked at the water. I'm not leaving at the end of 11 weeks, she said. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was very quiet. I know, he said, but I needed you to say it. Why? Because I built a framework to keep you here, he said, and I needed to hear you say you're staying outside of it. She looked at him. She crouched down to his eye level, a gesture she'd made on a gymnasium floor months ago in a different context, a gesture she was making again now in the same way. Not pity and not performance, just the simple equalization of two people looking at each other from the same height. She touched his face, her hand against his jaw, her thumb at the corner of his mouth. The cold of the garden and the warmth of his skin and the fountain moving in the basin and the house behind them and every terrible, complicated, true thing that had brought them here. He closed his eyes. I loved you before I understood what the feeling was, he said. She had known he would say something like this. She had not known it would hit her like it did, in the specific place where all the things she'd protected for a long time lived, the place she'd learned to keep defended through years of overnight shifts and debt collectors, and the sustained effort of being the only person in her own life she could fully rely on. I know, she said. I know you did. I will spend— Don't, she said quietly. Don't promise me things about the rest of your life. We don't know what the rest of our lives look like. She held his face in her hand. Just be here. That's enough. He opened his eyes. She kissed him. Not the wedding. The wedding had been ceremony, formal and witnessed and shaped by the architecture of the arrangement. This was the opposite of all of that. This was in a cold garden in the dark beside a fountain that had just been turned back on, with no witnesses and no performance and nothing designed or built or engineered by anyone living or dead. This was just hers. When she pulled back, his eyes were still closed. She stood up. She put out her hand. He looked at it for a moment. Her hand, open, extended toward him in the lamplight from the terrace. Then he took it. She didn't pull him up. She just held his hand, and he held hers, and they stayed like that beside the fountain for a while, and the water moved in the basin, and the winter garden was quiet around them. And somewhere across the city, Edna Arden was sleeping in a warm bed at Harmon Private Medical, with a transplant evaluation on track, and a coordinator who knew to call directly. And somewhere in the city, Seraphine Vale was signing a withdrawal document and exiting the architecture she'd spent 3 years constructing. And somewhere in a trust office, a quarterly confirmation was filed and countersigned and settled. All of it stood behind them. The empire, the document, the cost of surviving each other. All of it, and somehow them too. Two people who had been assembled by a dead man's intelligence and a desperate woman's poverty, and one man's decision to look at a profile and think, this one is real. Standing beside a fountain in a garden that was finally not frozen, with their hands in each other's hands. Not because the contract said so, not because the architecture held, because she had stood at a door in February and thought about walking away and had come back inside instead, and he had made chamomile tea at midnight and not signed his name, and between those two small, ordinary human things, something had been built that no one had planned and no one could dismantle. The water moved, the winter held, and they stayed.